Hello, Tungsten Miner here. Back again with thermal expansion and related mods. Last time we walked through some of the basic Origin and WorldGen stuff, some things you can do with that, a little bit of an example of some of the machines and how they interact, and then finally discussing some of the upgrades to be able to make more of your machines. So now let's jump in to the detailed walkthroughs of all those different machines. Okay, so let's dive into some of these machines now. In front of me, I've got a whole line of Redstone Furnaces. And that's because, as we talked about over here, there's a number of different specializations that the Redstone Furnaces can have. So I'm going to walk through each of them one at a time. First of all, here's the plain old Redstone Furnace. This has been augmented up to the resonant upgrade level. So I'm able to put 4 different augments in there. And in this case, just for demonstration purposes, I've gone ahead and put in some of the augments that increase the speed. And since I'm just doing a mod spotlight, I've just gone ahead and cheated in a creative flux capacitor. So this is basically a little battery that never runs dry and keeps the machine powered all the time, so that I can just demonstrate things without having to worry about that. So in this chest, I've got the kinds of things that you might normally throw into a regular furnace. So I can throw in some wood, and it's going to convert it to charcoal. I can throw in some iron ore, it's going to convert it into iron. And I can throw in some meat, and it's going to convert it into steak. Now you notice all of these exactly like what you'd get in a vanilla furnace, except way faster because I've got these augments in here. So even if you get nothing else out of it, you can get a much faster furnace. Basically, this, though, is going to act just like your regular vanilla furnace. Get rid of all this stuff and move on to the next one. This one has the specialization which has to do with food. So here, I'm going to take some food and some iron ore, and you'll notice when I try to put the iron ore in there, click, 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 it doesn't go. Nothing except food can go in here. But if I toss the food in here, we're going to see not only does it very rapidly go through it, because I've got these speed augments in here, but as we're roasting this whole pile, we're actually getting more output than we're putting in. So it like magically makes more food somehow in this process. Yeah, we're not even through the stack yet, and I've already got an extra 25% over what I should have expected. And in the end, I have exactly twice as much food as I started with. So just like you can use a Pulverizer to double your ores, you can use this Trivection Chamber to double your food. I don't know if it's always doubled, but it certainly always gives you much more than you would normally expect. Next up, we have an Flux Annodizers, which basically makes it so that you get additional ingots. So instead of going through this process I described over here of pulverizing and then going to the furnace, if you want to, you can make this augment, this Flux Annodizers, and automatically get that same benefit. So if I take, let's say, 4 and drop them in here, I should expect to get 8 back again, and sure enough I do. Now, you ask, why wouldn't you just make this to start with? Well, the recipe for this thing is a little bit on the advanced side, because you have to make invar, which means you need to find, let's see here, yeah, there we go. You need 2 iron and some nickel, and you can pulverize the iron using that pulverizer and pulverize the nickel and then blend them together to get invar. Or you can use a different process, which I'll talk about later. But you also need this compactor, which I'll talk about in a minute, and that gets you your invar plates. And pyrethium dust is also pretty hard to make, requiring some blaze powder and sulfur and all this stuff. So this is not a particularly easy part to make, is the point. And it may not be something that you're able to put together until a little ways into your game. So starting off, it makes more sense to make the pulverizer, which is actually fairly easy to put together, as compared to this thing, which is quite a bit harder. Next up, I have a furnace over here, which has this Pyrolytic Conversion plugin, or module, augment, whatever you want to call it. Basically, this allows the furnace to do a couple of special processes that transform various items, and in the process produce creosote, which is a liquid that can be used for a number of fairly useful things. So here we've produced a tiny bit of creosote oil while making charcoal, which of course is what we would have normally expected. But I can also do the same thing for cactus. I think you need, what, 4 of these? Yeah, 4 of these. And it takes a bit longer apparently. There we go. And that made half as much creosote. Or you can just take coal and drop it in there, and that's going to make quite a bit of creosote. And it's going to make coal coke. So coal coke is pretty useful as a fuel because it burns twice as long as coal does. And you can also use it in one of the machines we'll talk about soon to make steel, which, as you might expect, is a good deal better to have than just regular iron. And this creosote stuff, let's see here. Looks like we can't do it that way, so we'll do it over here. Yeah. This creosote can be used to make a bucket. Oh, it looks like... Yeah, it looks like the only purpose of it, at least in this mod, is to just be burned, and so you can use it as fuel in a compression dynamo. There are other mods, Railcraft, for example, that use creosote for making items. So having that at hand, hopefully it's compatible with Railcraft. This is brand new. This is was not there last time I looked at thermal expansion, so I'm not entirely sure where the mod author's going with that. Suffice to say, I suspect they will endeavor to have them be mutually compatible so that you can wind up with both things. So that gives us all of the different types of redstone furnaces. Our Pyrolytic Conversion redstone furnace for making creosote and charcoal and coal coke, Flux Annodizer to get double your ores, Trivection Chamber to get double your food, and of course your regular redstone furnace. Next, let's talk about the Pulverizer. So just like before, I've gone ahead and augmented this thing out to make it so much faster that we can just watch it go. And Pulverizers are used for breaking down some object into its constituent parts, and all of these are things that you can run through the Pulverizer. So let me show you how some of this works. A diamond axe, you can toss it in there and it's going to grind off all the wood and give you back your diamonds. Copper ore is a good example of getting a secondary output. Here we go. Yeah, so I expected to get this 8 pulverized copper because I put in 4 ores and it doubles them. That's the expected output. The extra output in this case is a little bit of gold, which will turn into 1 ingot of gold. So just by pulverizing instead of smelting, I not only doubled my ore, but I got something extra that I couldn't possibly have anticipated getting out of any kind of vanilla smelting process. I can take my charcoal and convert that to pulverized charcoal, the use of which, one, you need it to make that pyrolytic conversion thing we just talked about, and you can also use it to make phytogrow, which we'll talk about. It's a kind of fertilizer that you can use in a certain machine. And it can be used to make steel instead of using coal coke, if you prefer. Next, I've got a diamond ore, and this will grind up the diamond ore and give you double your diamonds. So worth finding a Silk Touch magic book in order to enchant and get your diamond ore directly. You can toss wood in there and get sawdust out again. Sawdust is not fantastically useful, but it does have its uses. You can make paper out of it. You can make it into compressed sawdust, which can then be smelted into charcoal, so you've got yourself an energy source. And you can also take that compressed sawdust and run it through the pyrolytic conversion process to also produce creosote at the same time. If you take some dyed wool and toss it in there, it's mostly going to give you string back again, but every once in a while it will free up some of the dye that went in, and so you can get yourself dye back again. Now this can be a source of like perpetual dye, right? Because you can make a sheep be dyed once with one piece of dye, and then clip off its wool, and then run that through a pulverizer and get as much dye as you want. So this is a way to produce an infinite amount of dye, potentially. Grind up netherrack, you get gravel, and the secondary output that you occasionally will get is sulfur. I wasn't lucky this time, but sometimes. Blaze rod. Now you can craft blaze rods and get blaze powder, but here you always get 4, and that's a bit more than you normally get. You always get sulfur. Crushing up obsidian, you get obsidian dust or pulverized obsidian. This is useful for making petroleum dust, but also it's useful in the induction smelter for making hardened glass, which has a number of different uses in crafting a lot of different things. But it's the one essential component, and then some kind of metal. So you get hardened Constantan glass, or hardened signalum glass, or hardened gold glass, or bronze glass, or whatever kind of glass. You can also make basalt's powder just by dropping in some destabilized redstone, but we'll talk about how that works in a little bit. Glowstone, you toss it in there, and you will always get 4 glowstone dust, so it's not variable. You can take any kind of flour and toss it in there and get the appropriate dye, except you get 4 of them instead of 1. You can toss sandstone in there, and of course you're going to get sand back again, but you can also sometimes, not every time, get niter. And niter is used in a whole bunch of different things, and this is kind of the only way to get it. So you wind up collecting a lot of sand, crafting it to sandstone, grinding it down, and hopefully freeing up the niter. That allows you to make phytogrow of various kinds. It allows you to make all these different kinds of magic dusts, and it allows you to augment your slag into phytogrow as well. So very handy substance and not easy to find. So sandstone is your path to finding niter. You can also take pre-made ingots and grind them back into pulverized whatever. This is mostly useful because if you're going to take your ore and run it through the machine and get yourself some pulverized iron, you're almost always going to wind up as part of an ore processing step. Immediately run it through a furnace so that you wind up with ingots, and that's the most useful form. But every once in a while, you need to make some kind of metallic blend, which means reducing it back to a powder so that you can blend them together. And so you can take any form of iron or whatever kind of metal and run it back through the pulverizer in order to get that pulverized metal back again. Very handy tool, lots of stuff you can do with it, and it has an augment, which is this Tectonic Initiator. Basically, this is going to increase your yield from ores. So the other thing, though, is you need this Tectonic Petroleum, and the recipe for this is this guy, this petroleum dust, and you run it through a machine we'll talk about in a little bit. So when we get there, I'll explain how that works. But suffice to say, you have to have done that to supply the fuel to run this Tectonic Initiator. But if you've gone to the trouble, you can take your iron ore or whatever kind of ores and drop it in there, and instead of getting 2, you'll get 3. Dusts back again. So this is the way to triple your ore. All right, so you can double your ore by using a regular pulverizer. You can triple your ore by using this Tectonic Initiator. And there actually is a process to quadruple your ore, which I will talk about when we get to that machine, but we're not quite there yet. And then finally over here, you can take all of these different dusts and run them through just a regular furnace in order to get the ingots. But you can also take certain ones in various combinations and get different alloys. So if you take 2 pulverized iron and 1 pulverized nickel and blend them together, you wind up with Invar blend, which makes a superior kind of iron. Copper and tin will give you bronze in 3-to-1. 1-to-1 copper and nickel will give you Constantan, and 1-to-1 gold and silver will give you electrum. All of these get used in building the various parts and machines and things that come with the mod. So sooner or later you'll have to figure out how each of these works. Next up is the sawmill. So if the pulverizer grinds ores, the sawmill grinds logs. And basically it works kind of as you'd expect it to. It can grind up lots of different things. So here's some examples I picked out. Of course, you can take regular wood and toss it in there. And you're going to get 6 planks instead of 4. And you have the possibility, although not 100%, of generating some sawdust. You can also take things made out of wood. So you can take a boat, for example, and grind it back down to its parts. But you'll notice you don't get back 5 planks, you get back 2. So anything that's already been made into some kind of object, you're never going to get quite everything back again. If you take an object that's made up of multiple things, you're going to get back, well, multiple pieces. Now, I didn't get back all of the wool or all of the wood, but I got back some of it anyway. You know, a note block, remember it's got some redstone in the center, so I get the redstone back again. You can actually take leather armor and chop it to bits. You will not get back all of the leather, but you'll get back at least some of it with the possibility of an extra piece. You may or may not get that extra piece. And you can also take melons and cut them up very conveniently. So Sawmill's very handy if you need a lot of wood, but it's also handy for getting rid of stuff that you don't actually have much of a need for anymore. Doesn't work with everything, should be said. Okay, so next up we have a sawmill with a resin funnel augment. And depending upon exactly what you toss in there, you can get one of two different kinds of fluids. If you take some oak wood and toss it in there, you're going to wind up with sap. Now the sap can be used for making regular phytogrow into rich phytogrow. Of course, you can toss it in a bucket and you can toss it in a tank, but really that's kind of it. That's what you use it for. But it can be handy for that if you're doing a lot of growing and you need this as fertilizer. The other thing that you can get, so it turns out I've got underneath here a nullifier, which you might recall is a device that just deletes things. So I'm going to get rid of our output here. So I've gotten rid of all the sap that was in there. And I'll turn that off and drop in some spruce wood. And that's going to get us some resin. Now the resin is a bit more useful because you can take it and toss it into one of the machines we'll talk about in the future and turn that into tree oil, which itself can be used as a fuel. So you can burn the stuff and get actually a fair bit of energy out of it, which means, of course, that this can turn into a pretty decent source of renewable energy, which is kind of an important thing to get yourself set up with eventually. So resin coming from spruce logs going through a sawmill is one source of that. We're also going to talk about a machine where you can extract it directly from the tree without having to cut it down. But in this case, you might have already needed the wood, and here's a way to rescue some useful material from that as well. And that's it for the sawmill. Next, we have the Induction Smelter. So this is a machine that allows you to combine two different ingredients together plus heat. So you're going to melt them both and mix them together in order to produce some kind of interesting output. So let's talk about some of the things you can do with this. First, if you have some object that's made mostly out of metal, you can generally toss it in here with a little bit of sand. You always need two items, so it'll never work without two items. Sand is almost always an acceptable second item for whatever purposes, but it's almost always the least useful. But in any case, we can free up the gold from that axe. So that being done, let's talk about some of the other things that are more interesting. First of all, if I take some iron ore and I take some sand and put these in here, I'm going to just produce the output that I normally would have expected. You know, I'm basically smelting and doubling at the same time. But there's a possibility, and I'm kind of, there we go, that you'll get some of this rich slag. Now, this is pretty handy stuff. First of all, you can use it for making rich phytogrow, which is a good deal more useful than the regular kind. But you can also use it in that second slot. And when you do, you're going to triple your ore production and have a pretty good chance of producing regular slag, which has its own purposes. So this works with just about every kind of metal. You can more or less triple all of your metal. So if you start off with your induction smelter using regular sand and double your ores plus get a little bit of rich slag, you can kind of set that rich slag aside for when you find some metal that maybe is harder to find. Maybe you're just running low and you want to be able to produce more of it, and triple the ore production for that particular kind of metal. Next up, if you're using slag, which is one of these byproducts, as your catalyst, go on, get in there. Oh, sorry. Yep, you can use rich slag, but not regular slag. When I was setting up the examples, I got a little overeager. We just talked a little bit about how this works, so just as an example, sure enough, it does work. Using rich slag, I can get triple instead of double. And cinnabar is one of the outputs from either pulverizing redstone ore. So if, again, you've got your silk touch, you can pulverize the ore and sometimes get cinnabar. And sometimes, very, very rarely, you'll get it when you're pulverizing gold. So yet another good reason to pulverize your metals and release those secondary things. And pretty much all the stuff that you can do with the pulverizer, you can also do with the Tectonic Initiator. So remember, part of the same device. It just increases your odds a bit of getting those secondary outputs. Anyway, so when you toss these two guys together, you're going to triple your ores, but you're also 100% of the time going to get that secondary output. So in this case, nickel's not that hard to come by, but sometimes that secondary output is really, really hard to find. So for example, if I had nickel ore, I could wind up getting platinum as a secondary output. And that's actually pretty rare, so that's a really handy thing. So if you can, get yourself some silk touch, harvest your redstone ore to get the ore itself, and run the ore through the induction smelter to free up the cinnabar, and use the cinnabar on your nickel ore to get platinum. I know, it's a little complicated. Once you get into the mod, it will make a lot more sense. Let's get rid of some of this stuff here, and then next up, we can take our pulverized obsidian that we talked about in the pulverizer, and any kind of metal, I'm just happening to use lead in the moment, and you get yourself some hardened glass. The hardened glass is used as a crafting component in a whole lot of different things, so you will find that you need a lot of this stuff. Fortunately, all of these recipes use whatever kind of hardened glass. It can be any kind of metal, basically, plus 4 pulverized obsidian, and that's it. So whatever kind of metal you have the most of is what you want to make your hardened glass out of. And it's just pulverized obsidian plus 1 ingot of metal, 4 to 1, and you get 2 hardened glass. Next, we have pulverized coal and some iron, which we can use to make steel. And steel is just another metal in the game. It's one of the alloys. It's harder than iron, and it has its usefulness in making slightly better tools than you could do otherwise. You can also melt 2 metals together, and this basically is all the same proportions that we talked about with the pulverizer. But you can do this directly without having to go through the step of making the blend and then smelting the blend. You can just take the raw ingots, toss them in there, and wind up getting back again the metal that you were looking for. Next, coal, coke, and iron. And that gives you steel, except all in one piece, so you don't need 4 of whatever it was. And then finally, I think actually we already talked about this. Probably should have put these in the other order. You can put your redstone ore and some sand, and you'll get yourself a block of redstone, and sometimes, pretty often, a bit of rich slag. Lots of stuff you can do. I only covered like a small smattering, but a representative smattering. There's lots of other ways, for example, of making hardened glass, but I think you get the picture. Metal and obsidian gets you hardened glass. So, very handy machine. It's one of the ones you'll want to make rather earlier on in your game. Here we have another induction smelter, but this time I've added the Pyro-Concentrator. And this is how you get quadruple production for your ores. But you do have to make this blazing pyrethium, which is itself made just by melting down, and we'll talk about this magma crucible in a bit, pyrethium dust, which is made from blaze powder, redstone, pulverized coal, and sulfur. Remembering that sulfur is not super easy to come by. The best way to get it is by pulverizing blaze rods, but they're not easy to come by either. You can sometimes get it by grinding down nether quartz, sometimes by gathering netherrack, and this honestly is the easiest way, because netherrack is super easy to find, right? And it gives you a decent enough amount of sulfur that you can just burn through whole stacks of it, getting the sulfur that you need. And honestly, you don't need that much of it. But there are other ways to get it too, but basically only through sulfur, or only through the pulverizer. This is basically just the augmented pulverizer. It is sometimes an output for 1 recipe on the induction smelter, and it is a byproduct of doing something with the fractioning still, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But yeah, get some netherrack. That's the cheapest and most available way. I forgot to give myself some sand, so I'm going to steal some from over here. Right, so here I'm going to take my iron ore, and if I toss in just some, let's do this and that, I get triple plus rich slag. If I take the rich slag plus an iron ore, I get quadruple. I don't think anything different happens if you use cinnabar, but I should have some over here so we can find out. Let's see, can I quintuple my ore? Nope, but I do get that secondary output. So quadrupling your ore is the best you can do, but it requires having this blazing pyrotheum, which is not easy to come by. So you got to really, really want it if you want to quadruple your ore, or have a blaze rod farm or something so that you can get that stuff. Anyway, that's the induction smelter, all about blending two things together that normally need to be melted in order to do the blending. And I think I'm going to end it there. So this time we've talked about the Redstone Furnace, the Pulverizer, the Sawmill, and the Induction Smelter. And next time we'll carry on with some more of those thermal expansion machines. So if you'd like this video, hit like. If you want to know when that next one's going to be ready, hit subscribe, and I will talk to you later.